Well, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're just waiting for everyone else to just come in. And my name is Gurneet, and I also work at the York Region Food Network this summer as communications policy research intern. And we have, quite an array of panel speakers and keynote for you today. And we're excited to, get into conversation. And just to start off with a land acknowledgement. On behalf of the York Region Food Network, we live and work on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe people, and we acknowledge the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation as our closest Indigenous community. Many of our practices, including our organizational structure, the seeds we plant, the foods that we prepare, and the ways we educate, and our methods of growing, harvesting, and preparing food come from these lands through the ongoing process of colonialism. We seek to hold this understanding in our interactions, engagements with the land and its people, as we are all tree people and play a role in reconciliation. So although we are joining virtually the land that we do grow our food and enjoy food on, it's really important to understand the relationship with Indigenous peoples. And if you'd like to learn more and maybe where you're located, definitely check out nativeland.ca. And just like an overview of what to expect today, we might be a little bit behind just because people are coming in, so no worries. The session is being recorded, and for all those maybe curious, we'll take questions and things at the end. Yeah, so probably see Morgan on the side. She's one of the she works at the York Region Food Network, as do I, for the summer. She is our food policy coordinator and doing cool things. And if you have any, we'll get into a lot of things afterwards about us as well and how to stay connected. So if anything pops up, feel free to just private message her. And for myself, my name is Gurneet. I'm a nutrition student. I'm studying out east in Halifax, but I live here in Vaughan in York Region, and my work is primarily grounded in diversity, nutrition, and just enjoying the summer job and kind of coming to an end, but great end because we get to involve the youth in the community and hear each other's stories and what we're all about. And a little bit about the York Region Food Network. We're not a TV show or channel, as maybe we are probably mistaken to be in other ways. So the vision for York Region Food Network is food for all, food for health, food for all. And our mission really to connect and empower people to access healthy food through education advocacy. And you can learn more at yrfn.ca. And we also have a welcome package, and Morgan's probably pasting that in the chat box. So feel free to connect with speakers and follow up through the welcome package, and feel free to engage online. Like we have our Instagram and Twitter down there, so feel free to take screenshots, share things, share your learnings and quotes, and hashtag York Region Food. I guess without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Jessica Katoaro Green. As an honors Bachelor in Arts graduate from Marshall University, Jessica is a gender equity advocate who continues to encourage systems and policy change to bring an equitable revolution to communities that have been made vulnerable. Jessica has a variety of disciplines with gender equity sector, including sexual violence, intimate partner violence, women's economic security, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, and paid care work with a wide range of organizations, both in public and private sector. Jessica really does a lot, and I feel like it was great to know that Jessica also lives in York Region, and I've been following her online for a lot of things. And I guess without further ado, Jessica can take it away and really go into depth of the work that she's doing and her story in York Region and from that intersectional lens that she has.
Thank you, Granita. I appreciate that. And hi, everyone. Like Granita said, my name is Jessica. I currently work with the Women of East Council of Toronto, doing research and policy, but I also do work with the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce, doing research and policy. So there's definitely a consistent theme across my interests there. But like Granita said, I do live in York Region. I actually live in Markham, and that's not something I always talk about, because of my work and so much of um, definitely focused in two areas, Toronto and Ottawa. I don't ever really get to talk about my experience growing up in Markham because nobody really knows Markham, or nobody really cares. So with that being said, I will be chatting today about how I have viewed and interpreted food security and its intersections in understanding access, A, and then B, how it sort of intersects with oppression and how it intersects with racism, which I think is quite interesting, and I hope you get to enjoy. Now, I will be putting about 5 minutes or so at the end of my keynote presentation for folks who may have any questions about what I've said, or if you want to have a small discussion in terms of things that I've brought up. There will be time at the end to discuss. Like I mentioned, lived in Markham, so I was not born in Markham, born in Toronto technically, but I've essentially lived here my whole life, as over 25 years or so. And so growing up in Markham has always been a very interesting experience, because where I live in sort of South Markham, there's a very large gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I'm going to get into that and what that sort of means a little bit later in my keynote presentation. But I think growing up as a young person, you didn't really understand the have or have-nots. It was just you had friends and they did things, and some friends couldn't do things that you could do, and you never truly understood why. But I think looking back and in reflection, and essentially in hindsight, you have a better understanding of why certain programs, certain resources and access was different for people who could afford it and people who could not. So with that being said, I'm going to jump right into my keynote presentation, in which I really want to begin at the beginning of the development of Canada, in which when we saw Canada being developed as how it is today, it really stems from being a Western capitalistic society. And a part of that is having food being used as a determinant of status. And so what I mean by that is that the type and quality of food that you're able to afford, or what you have access to, is in direct correlation with your economic status. And you can see this correlation in a couple different ways. The first is access. So if you're living in a wealthier neighborhood or you have access to a personal vehicle, your ability to get and access food increases, just based on the fact that you have access to a personal vehicle. And in wealthier neighborhoods, there's more investment in public transportation and so on and so forth. If you could think about this in sort of a smaller or more personal example, have you ever been to a grocery store and realized, oh, this thing that I'm looking for, that the bananas, they're sold out, or they're no longer in stock until the next shipment arrives? For folks with limited mobility, that's a huge barrier, because once those items are gone, it's unlikely for folks with mobility issues to be able to pick themselves up, jump in their car and say, okay, I'm just going to go to the grocery store down the street or 2 blocks away or whatever have you, and find bananas there. Whereas those who are wealthier can jump in their cars, jump in transportation, whether it be a taxi, an Uber, asking a friend, public transportation, and then pick up what they need there. So when we think about access, it's really about, there's a strong correlation in terms of a mobility. Who can go into a grocery store and have access to food? But not only do we see a problem with access and mobility, but there's also a huge problem about the cost of food. When we think about the cost for healthy foods, so items that are organic, grain-fed meats, wild seafood, healthier boxed food, basic fruits and vegetables even, compared to fast foods, the costs are extremely exclusive. So, for example, in my local grocery store, broccoli right now, for a crown of broccoli, it's about two something, versus a hamburger at McDonald's is $1.35, I think. I'm not really sure, but that disparity in the cost for good healthy food versus fast food is an extremely intentional part of our society's function around capitalism. It's a part of the way that our society is structured, that a hamburger from McDonald's costs $1.35, and that crown of broccoli costs $2.30 for a crown. And what causes this problem is the fact that not everyone is actually able to afford healthier options, as the prices, like I said, are prohibitive, especially when people are living paycheck to paycheck, or people are low income, which I believe it's 30% of Canadians actually live paycheck to paycheck. So we're talking about a significant portion of our population here who cannot actually access or afford healthier food options or good quality food options, I can say. And so this is another example of how we see the divide between those who can afford good food, who cannot. And just as a way of a small background, the divide between haves and have-nots has evolved from colonial practices and relationships to food. I want to make it clear that our food systems have been crafted to actually leave people behind, and good food has not always been there are where good food has been accessible. So ahead of colonial defamation, indigenous relationships to food made it so that every living thing, including humans and animals, had access to a share of food. But as time has gone on and history has evolved, the overproduction or waste, so actual food waste, sometimes I get shocked that that's even a term, but food waste didn't ever exist. The lack of access did not exist, and the cost to be able to eat didn't exist. And so when we discuss food insecurity or access to food, I think it's extremely important to keep in mind the role that colonialism has played in developing our understanding and relationship to food. Colonialism has dictated that our relationship to food centers around two things: gluttony and profit, instead of the basic right for people and animals to be able to meet their basic human needs. So again, it's that comparison between haves and have-nots, and those who have will have lots, and those who have not will have not. And so I think that this understanding can be applied to our society's current relationship, even to water use. There's a huge sort of policy demand or policy, an uptick in policy interest around water use. Again, in South Africa, they were running out of water. If you would believe, our planet is made up about 70 or 80% of water, but we were running out of fresh water. And so this is just, and so those who could afford to have water were able to bring in bottled water. They had tap water, running water. But what the government was saying at the time was that if we don't share our water equally and stop our gluttonous consumption, they'll have no water. So even if you have lots of money, nobody's going to get water. And so this dynamic is being demonstrated of have and have-nots, and our sort of gluttony and capitalistic production of food and water, of food, is even being rolled out into the discussion around water use and water consumption and wastewater and so on and so forth. Now, I know we're here to talk about food, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about water because I can go on for hours, but again, just another example of how there's synergies between different sectors and different industries around our relationships to natural resources, and essentially the basic needs to preserve human life. So I will I do want to talk about how in our current society, colonialism brought with it capitalism, and it's led to more people caring about profit than they do communities. So supporting business over community, supporting the needs of businesses, which are these non-living things, which blows my mind. Whereas we care more about these non-living entities than we do the actual people who work hard within these entities to keep them alive. Because at the end of the day, if there are no people, there are no business, and businesses are social constructs. And so our society still runs on that ideology that profit and our economy and money are more important than ensuring that the basic needs of people are met in our society. And part of the basic needs is, yes, shelter, yes, clothing and safety, but also food and access to water. And I think that's something, for some reason that I think has a lot to do with colonial practice or society, that our relationship to those things are all about money at the end of the day, and individual. It's not about the collective, and caring more about whether I have enough to keep myself sustainable, instead of caring for those who live beside me or my neighbor, or so on and so forth. And so because of this, we see this culture, this ideology also play out in York Region. And I will say York Region is not immune to racism or oppression, despite having an extremely wide intercultural representation. So what do I actually mean by all those fancy words is that, so racism, I see it as the institutional existence of white supremacy. Racism is embedded within the creation of our systems. Our systems were actually created to exclude racialized groups of people from having access to the benefits or privileges that were afforded to white folks. And the reason that this was put into place was the idea that white people were a superior caste of humans on a social hierarchy, which was implemented by white folks. I'll also add that. Than all other groups of humans, and that all other groups of humans, so we're talking about every single racialized body, every single non-white person, had to be taught how to be white. So we had, and that was the right way of living. So the way in which thought or envisioned a society, that was the right way. And so that's how our systems in Canada has developed in embodying those ideologies. And so that's why when I talk about when we talk about or have conversations around racism and systematic racism, this is what it means. It means that those who were in charge, which at the time were white men, they saw the world in one way, which was white, the white community, the white ideology, the white way of life was the best way of life, and all other racialized groups were inferior in comparison. And so Canada was built on that ideology, and our systems were created to benefit and support the development of white communities. And now, so many years later, I think the world has learned a lot about has learned to understand that that's not true. And so while we're supposed to be living in an anti-racist world, and I will say that Canadian laws reflect that, our actual systems that we operate and the culture and the way in which we live don't actually reflect that ideology. And again, it's because we've been sort of trained, and these ideologies have been passed down throughout generations, even by racialized folks. A lot of racialized folks can perpetrate racism or discriminatory practices because that's what they've been taught. But the development of our systems have been intentionally designed to exclude racialized communities, and racialized communities also tend to exclude themselves because of what they've been taught and the trauma that they've been internalized by future generations in terms of racism. And so when we talk about, again, the haves versus the have-nots, I pointed out earlier that we can see this relationship with food, and who has access to such a tool. I mean, to such resources. And food is a fundamental part of life. And we cannot have societies, we cannot have people without food. And so what our sort of racist systems do is use food and food systems, the food sector, industry, so on and so forth, as a tool to oppress racialized communities. So if somebody can control the way that you eat, when you eat, how often you eat, and what you can afford, then what they're doing is they are controlling your access to those things, and that in itself is oppression. And so I will give you a definition of what oppression is, or the way that I interpret oppression, just so that it can help to frame later conversations today. But I see oppression as a systematic and institutional abuse of power by one group at the expense of others, and the use of force to maintain this dynamic. Now, the force doesn't always have to be physical. It can be, it doesn't always have to be. But the idea is that they use force to push the ideology that there is a superior group of people within society, and some groups are inferior in society. And the force that can be used could be social, it could be emotional, it could be mental, and it shows up in different ways and at different levels. It's not always obvious or easy to spot. Sometimes it's really minute or hard to see. So what happens is that the ideology makes the oppressed group feel less than. And it hinders their ability to understand or reach their full potential, because they've been force-fed essentially this doctrine, which makes them feel less than. Oppression also enables those who are in charge to have access and control to resources, choices, while making those who feel inferior vulnerable to poverty, violence, and sometimes early death. And food plays a big role. Again, food plays a big role in this, especially when we consider what policies, programs, and strategies are in place to support those who don't have access to food. And when we think about the limited number of policies, programs, and strategies that exist, those pieces are all very, very intentional. And so when it's important that when we are talking about food, that we think about how has this impacted York Region, or what is sort of York Region's experience in this. And again, I speak from my own experience and speaking from things that I've seen in my community, as well as the Vaughan community, the Richmond Hill community, and the Stouffville community, in terms of things that I have, different community organizations have spoken to. But I'd like to touch on one thing, which is the breakfast programs within schools. Now, when it came out, it was early to mid 2000s, like 2010, 2008, which started as a really strong program to be able to support children and youth in schools, because what was found was that not every child in school had breakfast. And breakfast is seen as an extremely important part of the day, and an extremely important part of the day which contributes to young people's ability to learn and capture information. So what was found was that not everybody starting their day with breakfast, and a part of the reason why they didn't start their day with breakfast was because their parents simply couldn't afford it. So some kids were only having one meal a day, some kids had to skip meals, and so what ended up happening in the YRDSB, so the York Region District School Board, was that they rolled out this breakfast program so that kids could get, children and youth could get breakfast in the mornings. And while I think that this program is extremely strong and an important step in ensuring equal access to food and food security, regardless of a child's socioeconomic, of a child's parents' socioeconomic status, well, what we actually failed to see was that the program was implemented in schools and in communities which required it the most. So there was schools that had it, but not every single school. And so it was again a battle between the haves and have-nots. And then when it was rolled out in school, there were schools within York Region that didn't have enough to cater to the need of the young people who were asking for breakfast. So on the one hand, it's a sort of a good first step in the right direction, but what we needed to see was direct action from our leaders as young people to continue to scale this program so that it was more accessible to those who actually needed it the most. And that's what we actually failed to see. So I did also want to touch on the fact that in York Region, and with this program, it was extremely intentional. It's an extremely intentional policy decision, program decision, to not roll it out very, very widely. And it could be for a variety of factors or reasons, such as funding, such as availability, such as logistics. But the fact that it wasn't rolled out in an equitable manner, it speaks volumes to the people who are running the program. And so I think that we need to think about who are the bodies of people who are making these decisions, and how are they making these decisions, and who are they engaging when they're trying to make these decisions. And if we start to think about that, and then we think about how programs get rolled out, I think that there's a correlation between lack of representation, and there's a lack of community engagement when we think about these programs. So you're probably wondering, okay, Jessica, is there really racism in York Region? So after Toronto, York Region has one of the highest new immigrant populations in Ontario. Shout out to York Region. And so research has shown that most immigrants coming to Canada, specifically into Ontario, are racialized people. But unfortunately, immigration status also sometimes leaves them unable to secure work, or work that is well paid. And so we see in York Region that there are a lot of new immigrants who are left to choose between food and shelter, or food and clothing, or food and education, and full participation in society, unfortunately. And so because of that, their access to food is limited. This is also true within other racialized communities. So this is not just an experience of only immigrants or only migrants. This can be true for many different people in many different communities. But I did want to highlight this is an extremely common scenario or experience within or by a lot of immigrants to Canada, to Ontario, to York Region. And so why, or sort of an anti-oppressive or an oppressive sort of analysis as to why that this narrative is so common, is the misconception that these groups of people are lazy, that they don't want to work, and that they are low income, and that they are that they're lazy and they don't want to work, and that's why they depend on the government to be able to support themselves. The reality is that many of these people are extremely hardworking. I mean, they up and left another country, and then they came to a new place, and they're trying to figure out their life. Like, I've never left Markham, and I can't even imagine moving even to Toronto and trying to figure that out. So I think that the concept, or the misinterpretation that these people are lazy furthers the idea of systematic racism, in that these groups of people behave a particular way, and so we see the continuation of discrimination here, essentially. And that's why a lot of folks don't actually end up getting hired into jobs that are well paid, and they have to uptake work that is sort of under the table. Or when they reach out to social programs, they often don't, they're not able to receive full funding for things because of their status, or because they are actually sometimes feel shame to be able to go into these social welfare programs and access it. And so those who do go into it sometimes hold back because they feel shame for having to go out and ask for support from the government because of the negative stereotypes around their communities, and around people who look like them. So I want to say that I also want to be very mindful of our current global circumstance, and that I'm in that the COVID pandemic essentially has highlighted or exacerbated the existing or long existing problems within our society, food being one of them. There was many that were highlighted, but food was being one of them. And something interesting that I actually ended up seeing or hearing about or reading about was the fact that frontline workers throughout the pandemic were mostly racialized. I believe there are stats like 70 or 80% of people who were frontline workers were racialized. And when I'm talking about frontline workers, I actually mean grocery store clerks who were deemed essential to the basic functioning of our society during a pandemic. And so when we think about that, how essential these people were to making sure that everybody else in the area could still function normally, what I want to highlight is the fact that these people aren't actually paid according to their essential nature to supporting our basic functioning. They're not paid well, first of all. They don't get very fair benefits, so a lot of them don't even get paid sick days, unfortunately. And we see this, or this can be explained as an intentional, oppressive, and racist practice because of the bodies or the people who occupy those roles. It's almost commonly or mostly immigrant or racialized bodies again, and because of our sort of internalized, whether it be unconscious or very conscious and meaningful, lack of recognition for these bodies and who we care about. This is why we see the discrepancy between their essential nature or a core function to supporting our society and how they're paid. Because if the roles were reversed and we were to pay people based on their contributions to society, I'd probably say that frontline workers, teachers, firefighters, police officers, so on and so forth, would probably be paid so much more than somebody, let's say, who works at a bank in doing credit analysis. I don't know, just an example. But the idea is that we care more about those people who are supporting, again, our businesses, again, capitalism, than we do about the people who actually are in our front lines, in our community, and supporting our communities. So I touched on a couple different things. So I talked about COVID and how it's impact racialized bodies, capitalism, and how it sort of manifested this ideology in which food and our relationships to food are extremely centered around gluttony and profit, and how profit has been the thing that has or the seeking of profit has been the thing that has removed access or accessibility to food. Now, with all those things in mind, there's still so much that we could do, and so much that we can and should do to address these things, because the food sector doesn't need to continue racist practices. It doesn't need to continue oppressive practices. And as young people, we're in a very unique position in which we have the ears of our leaders. We are extremely involved in our community, and we need to stand up and say, okay, what can we do? Here's what we want. These are our demands, and we can make changes for our community that we want to see. We don't have to be sort of stagnant and let things sort of roll off as they always have been. But why would you care to do that? because it's an extremely large role, an extremely large task. And I will say people have been trying to do this for years. So, but why should we care right now? And the short and sweet answer is because food is a basic human right. We all need it. We can't survive without it. There's no question about that. But the problem is that our systems have created a dynamic in which racialized bodies are less likely to access their basic needs and support themselves to be able to do so. So we have this contrast, right? Like now we're saying everyone deserves food and food is a basic human right, but access and those who can access food, that basic human right, there's a discrepancy there. And so this is why we need to care. And this is why we need to do things now to be able to address that. I think we need to switch our narrative to be able to support communities and stop thinking about, profit could be a part of the conversation, but I don't think it needs to be the only part of the conversation. There's this very interesting theory or principle coming out of economics called the triple bottom line. So people, planet, and profit. So people caring about our communities and making sure we're making investments into our communities and our communities have equitable access to what they need to sustain themselves. Planet, making sure that the way our food systems work and the way our systems work is that they're not creating intentional large-scale damage to our planet. And so we're as green and we're as eco-friendly as possible. And the last one is profit. And that's about making money, growing our economy, and supporting economic growth and development. And the idea is that these three things are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist. We just need to challenge our ideologies and our understandings of the way that our systems are created to be able to address these three things concurrently, and addressing these things in a way that supports people, both all three: people, planet, and profit. I think that just sort of as a last note, the way that I see the future of food is to dismantle the systematic continuation of the haves versus have-nots, and to create policies which allow a wider access to food regardless of your socioeconomic status, and making sure that we have equal, that there's an equitable access to food. So not only are you able to see that there's a wider access to food, but equitably based on what you can afford, based on what you can access. That is how we're shaping policies. I think, or strategies or programs. I think the sort of one size fits all narrative around food policies, around food program strategies, so on and so forth, it doesn't fit, it's not working. And it actually only widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And so I think when we think about dismantling our systems and our systems of oppression and our systems of racism, it's really about challenging where those ideologies have come from, which I've spoken about, and thinking about, okay, what are the actual needs of the community? Where is their need, and how can we create programs and strategies to address those specific needs? I thank you all for listening. That's sort of all for my keynote speech. I don't know how much time we have, Gurney. You let me know, but I will leave it open for questions or comments or a quick discussion.
I would just be like, if it was in real life, you can hear everyone's applause, but you kind of hear one-sided applause. Unfortunately, I guess there isn't like that much time, but definitely like if there's 5 minutes, if anyone has any burning questions, things like that.
Are some questions in the chat box that I'll address super quickly. So Alicia asked, what are some ways that high schoolers can work to improve breakfast programs at their schools? Or what are some signs that a breakfast program may not be equitable? So the first thing is that you can improve your breakfast program by quite simply speaking to your administration and saying, we want more. And then your administration will then take it off to their superintendents. But the thing that a high schooler can do right now to take the issue to your administration without telling them or letting them know that you have this issue. They're unlikely to acknowledge it or even know that it exists. So I think that'd be the first thing. The second thing that you may see is to find that your breakfast program is not equitable is the if I don't know if you've ever watched this, but it's quite interesting that sort of at the if you've ever noticed that some people sort of go to participate in the breakfast program and they don't, that's a sign that there's not enough to go around, and that's a sign that there's a need for more. So that's I think one thing that we could that you could identify in terms of identifying if your breakfast program is equitable or not, and then taking that conversation to your admin, your administrative team at your school. And I will say, just as a quick note, that's an example of advocacy work. And so the more young people from your high school that you can rally together to say we want this, the more likely you are to actually get your demands, if you will, heard, or your issue solved. There is another question here. Let's see. Second Harvest asks, from an individual level, what should we be doing to foster a more just food system? Oh, that's very interesting. As an individual, I think that as an individual, if you are able to and you can afford, quite simply what you could do is donate to more food banks, or support with your dollars to more community-led food banks, or other organizations who are doing really awesome social justice work. I think that's really what you could do at an individual level. You can call your city councilor, you can call your MPP, you can call your MP and say, hey, this is an issue in my area and we need support. But there's definitely a wide range of things that we could do.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, I guess, thank you so much, Jessica. And I just want to apologize. I know there's a bit of disruption, but it does seem to be under control, and with the slides and everything. I guess if anyone wants to follow up with Jessica, feel free to, and we'll be sharing a lot of, I guess, contact information, everything in the booklet afterwards. So I just wanted to thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us. And I know we'll dig a lot more into the panel discussion about the things that you laid out there about food justice, about anti-racism, anti-oppression, and like what, yeah, getting into being a youth in York Region, and what type of food system do we want to see and be a part of for the future.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Grady, for having me, and I'll stick around to answer any other questions in the chat, but I will have to run after that. So I hope that the rest of the panel and the event goes really well.
For sure. And I guess just kind of just double checking everything. Okay. So any other questions coming in? Okay. So I guess we can move on to the panel now. And so we have a couple people lined up here, and we'll just go through everyone's bio and then kind of go into the questions, and feel free again to engage in the chat box, things like that. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Jessica Tong. Jessica is someone I met a year ago at the York Region Food Network, does a lot of great stuff with just coordinating the garden and everything else in between. So here's a little bit more about Jessica. Born in Singapore, raised in Scarborough, works in New York Region. So we do have that connection here. And Jessica is most passionate about food justice and its intersections with anti-oppressive frameworks. She navigates this work with understanding that different communities have particular historical and contextual relationships with food and land. And with her partner, she operates a small organic vegetable farm that sells at local farmers markets and through a CSA, so Community Supported Agriculture Program. And I'm sure we'll get to hear a lot more about Jessica and her agriculture background, and I guess, yeah, essentially like youth being in charge of the food system and buying from youth, and maybe that's the future that we're going to. And next we have is Umbier, and Umbier is a Tamil Canadian high school student who adores slam poetry that I know of. Makes people happy, and how those two things intertwine. It's very true. I can say, like, personally knowing MBA through the Tamil Archive Project, and also Tamil Futures. We're part of a fellowship kind of mentorship program through Healing Arts Inner Circle, and we're actually holding an event later this month called Loneliness, Lunchbox and Loneliness. So stay tuned for like more updates on that. And MBA does a lot for being a youth, and sometimes we are like, are you really that young, MBA, doing all these things? So a little bit more, I guess, from like the artistic perspective. She recently collaborated with the Koffler Digital in their A Matter of Taste series. Presently teaches American Sign Language as a youth worker. And yeah, I guess she works to understand the power of the ability to communicate and how to harness its I don't know, you use really big words and I can't even do that, and I'm doing a thesis. So yeah, essentially, like, we'll really hear about MBA's youth voice growing up in Markham, seeing all the work that she's involved with, and kind of like, I guess, reimagining the future of youth, and activism and advocacy and what that looks like. And last but not least, we have Charlene. Charlene is a proud daughter of Peruvian immigrants. She's completing her master's in public health at University of Toronto with a dietetic internship to become a registered dietitian. So with yeah, I know Charlene just through the dietetics work, and also very involved with kind of bringing the food aspect to public health, and was a part of Food Secure Canada's volunteers with Food Secure Canada's Youth Caucus. And in the past, Charlene has worked in food literacy for children and youth and community nutrition programs, and lives in Vaughan and Whitchurch in Vaughan, in the Vaughan community. And I guess we'll really get to hear her perspective of like food justice, nutrition, health, and all those intersections. And I guess we have everyone lined up here. And I guess like the first question I kind of wanted to ask, maybe we can start off with Jessica, is actually no, because Jessica, you work in York Region, so we'll kind of go in between. So maybe we'll start off with Charlene and Umbihe. What has your experience as a youth growing up in York Region been like? So we can start off with Charlene.
Okay, sorry, I was just having trouble with the unmute there. Yeah, so thank you for inviting me and inviting me to this place to talk about food. So I've pretty much lived in Vaughan since I was very young, and pretty much in the same house. So growing up in York Region, I felt very lucky, and I know I was very privileged growing up in a place where I felt safe pretty much the whole time. You know, I had access to parks where I could play outside. I could walk to school safely. So growing up in York Region was overall a great experience, and I've always felt safe, and I'm very grateful that my parents chose an area and they had the access to do that as well, to move here, because like many other people who I think live in Vaughan, maybe they started in a different city. Like we were in Toronto first, and then we moved to York Region. So I've definitely felt very privileged and lucky to grow up in York Region. And I've recently moved back. I've like lived in different cities recently in maybe the last 5 years. So it's definitely kind of different to come back at an older age and like look back. You know, when you're younger, you want to leave, you want to explore. But now that I'm back, I'm like, you know what, I've definitely had more of an appreciation for it.
Yeah, and I guess like with that point, I can say the same. Like I moved to Vaughan as well, and you do the privileges there. And I guess my coworker Jordan and I wrote a piece. Jordan lives in Markham. We were just talking about how, even like from Jessica's talk earlier, like that privilege aspect of being in York Region, how that does mask poverty. And when you think about, yeah, food insecurity, I know there's a lot of donations, and you might get your flyers and you might go to a grocery store here and see like donate to your food bank or donate some money for food. And when you think about that, that's essentially going to your like neighbors and others in the community. And according to recent data, the numbers are probably up. There's almost like around 25,000 people in your region that are food insecure. So that's really something to consider and look into more. And how about your experience, MBA, growing up in York region?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Granite, for like the very, very awesome introduction. But my experience growing up, I mean, I guess some would say I'm still growing up. I'm 17. But like, so when I started grade 9, I moved to a different school, and it's near Fairview Mall. So I actually go to high school in Toronto, but I always equate York region with kind of school, like elementary school, and my family. I moved to like schools a lot when I was a kid, but I lived in the same house. But finally, when I guess I reached some sort of stability in 5th grade, I was going to the school down the street, and my family, when they immigrated here, or when I guess like they claimed asylum or whatever, they came here, and they were sponsoring all of their family. We all moved into York region. So my mom came when she was in grade 10, and they basically grew up here as well. And then when I was born, they moved into this house. So I always equate being in this place with my family and that sense of communal care, right? And being able to kind of grow as a village and as a community. And I tend to romanticize things a lot, but I always found that kind of beautiful, as in like I could go 5 minutes somewhere and I would always have someone to talk to or someone to be around. And on top of that, I had school, and York region in itself is very diverse. Like there was no lack of me seeing someone who didn't look like me or someone who couldn't relate to me. But yes, all of my elementary school teachers were white. But when you think about people of color and my classmates and the people that I was surrounded with, they were all people who understood to some extent what I was going through at home, or we could relate to some point. So it was a very inclusive atmosphere. And on top of that, there were still cultures that I could learn from, and food that I could learn to enjoy, and food and my food that I could share. And people were totally open to that. And that's what I loved about York region.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really great to hear. And just like, yeah, continuing to live here and experience those things and be connected. I guess, yeah, like thinking about the other municipalities we're connected with. And I think that will probably like come up in discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess kind of like, I'm like, Jessica can also talk about that. Just working in York region, living in different parts. What's your experience been like, Jessica?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I did grow up just on the border, just south of Markham, and spent a lot of time in Markham growing up. So, um, yeah, like it's so interesting. Like York region is such an interesting area where, um, like Markham compared to Georgina are both in York region, but they're completely different landscapes, right? So. Um, yeah, it's always difficult to just like talk broadly about York region as one monolith, um, but yeah, it's definitely been interesting. Like growing up just south of Markham, you know, that's where all to me like Scarborough, Markham, that's where like so much good food lives, right? But uh, yeah, that sort of connection to the food in that specific location, it has always been really important to me. So whenever it's like, oh, where do you know, if we're gonna actually go out and get food that feels really like, you know, home to us, it's let's go back to Scarborough, let's go back to Markham. Yeah, so that's sort of been my experience is really location, like where I grew up, it was rooted in my relationship to the food around, and like my grandma lives there, she cooks us food and that kind of thing. And then now I live in Bradford, which is sort of the opposite end of what Markham and Scarborough would have been like. So it's, yeah, it's it's sort of like a foot in or a leg in each area. Yeah, it's sort of a similar experience with being like from, you know, an immigrant family, right? Like you kind of straddle two different identities or two different ways of life. So yeah.
Yeah, and I guess with everyone's point, like food is really integral to our culture and the way we are brought up. And sometimes, yeah, like going to school or seeing how others talk about our food and culture, and it's through the dominant lens, or um, that colonial piece, like Keynote Jessica talked about as well. Just, yeah, it's embedded in our system, so it is there. I guess it goes back to how do we reclaim it and kind of change that narrative. It's, I know, just having like knowing each of you differently and like having these discussions, we, yeah, being in York Region, being youth or talking about youth interaction, who really gets control over food? Is it just something we end up buying, or do we have control over it? Or is it more like going somewhere else to find what like truly does connect back to us? And I guess that kind of, yeah, I guess we talked a little bit like going back to Toronto, being near the border. And I guess like the food landscape aspect, I think what I'm trying to get at and thinking about is, yeah, you do go to your grocery store and like my parents, like they love mangoes. Where are they gonna go get their mangoes from? Probably their traditional store, going to an Asian market, going to their Indian store. And oftentimes that is a little bit outside of Toronto or going elsewhere, or outside of York Region and going elsewhere. So, and like food prices, yeah, going to a different grocery store where, yeah, maybe you're buying something for like $3, but the produce doesn't look happy. I just, yeah, doesn't look happy. But if you go to like a fancier store or higher end store, like it's expensiver, but it looks better. And what about affordability, that aspect of things? Yeah, eating healthy, being able to afford it, income, huge thing. And even the aspect of like thinking about jobs. York Region actually has a high rate of precarious work, and yeah, thinking about like food service, thinking about working at the grocery store. There's a lot of that. And COVID has really impacted it. And who are the people that you do see in these spaces and being impacted? That racial disparities do exist. And I guess that kind of goes into like public health. And I'm just thinking, Charlene, like, I guess thinking about the second question, how would you describe the food landscape, or even like thinking about COVID, I guess, how do you see like the social determinants of health, and maybe grounding a discussion on that point for us?
Yeah, like Jessica said, I think because York Region is so big, the food landscape really depends on where you are. Like I've been to Georgina, you can easily see farmland there, but in Vaughan, where I am, there's like very little farms. If people heard farm, they'd probably think like Highland Farms or like a grocery store. So I think because that food environment here in Vaughan is like that, we kind of lose that connection to agriculture. So when we're talking about COVID-19, where we saw like so many outbreaks happening in farms, in food processing plants. So I think this time, like because of the pandemic, I've been thinking a lot about where does our food come from? What is my connection to food like? And I think it's difficult if you live in a place where your food environment, you don't see any farmland. So you don't really know how food is grown, where it comes from, who grows your food. And when we're talking about public health, like there's a really like horrible public health issue happening with like migrant food workers. And that's something, you know, like they've had issues for so long, but we're just seeing it more now because COVID-19 has highlighted, you know, the essential worker, the hero. So now we're hearing more about like how farms depend on migrant food workers. But you know, is it at an expense of our food security? I've been thinking a lot about that. Is my food security at the expense of like humans and their health and safety? And this is where like food and nutrition intersect with public health. You know, it's not essential work. It should be essential lives. Like what's happening to migrant food workers is it's just been like a horrible situation. I've definitely think our food environment, we have to think about that too, right? You know, so if we go to the grocery store, it's difficult to think about the people who grow your food. All we see is maybe like Foodland Ontario. We can kind of distinguish our local foods, but many of those local foods are grown by people who don't even have permanent residency here, which is something they're fighting for. Like they really need that. So yeah, I can go on a little bit more about that, but I think our food environment definitely differs so much in York region. Like when I think of like going to farm stand, I would go to your Georgina or Newmarket or Aurora. And it's difficult to do that in Vaughan.
Yeah, and even like the aspect of yeah, who's growing that food, and like, you know, going and getting the cucumber and being like, it's a little bit more expensive. I don't want to pay $2, but like $2 for you, thinking about how much the person that's working for is getting paid, and if it's organic, or if like, yeah, thinking about like, are these people paid equitably? And again, there is a lot of discussion about like even nutrition, sustainable diets and things like that, or being vegetarian or vegan. But when you really dig deeper, who is it at, like at the expense of who? Are you trying, like, if you're being healthy or trying to be whatever that term healthy means to you, type of thing? Like, does it come at an expense, or what? Like, yeah, a lot to really unpack, and we don't really get to have these discussions, and it's something to really like look into. And I guess even thinking like for you, Jessica, like farming, and like what type of hurdles have you faced just being like a young farmer trying to do this type of work here? Because you hear a lot about it in Toronto, like urban farming. People are like, yeah, let's start gardens, let's do this. But what is it like, yeah, being a racialized individual in York region, which does, I guess, it falls under the horseshoe type of conservation area, which I think produces the second most produce, or like profits in agriculture in Ontario.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a lot of talk, right, about like the majority of farmers right now are over the age of 50, and like we're having a shortage of people taking over. So there's a lot of talk about like youth coming into agriculture and the need for that, but there still isn't enough like reflection of that in the supports within the system. And yeah, like if you, I think there's this necessary shift that has to happen within agriculture and how we think about agriculture in terms of like who's a farmer. There's always this romanticization of farmers, but not the farm workers. So the people who are actually out in the fields, like doing that labor. We don't celebrate those folks who are doing the hard work and actually growing our food. So yeah, like that sort of shift of understanding of who's a farmer, what a farmer looks like, what farming even looks like, right? So like when we talk about agriculture, a lot of times those conversations shut out different ways of growing food and like different relationships to land. So you know, we always think about like straight rows on a farm, whereas, you know, there are certain cultures that grow in circles or grow just in different ways. So yeah, I think there really needs to be some sort of shift in how we understand what agriculture even means and looks like, and what food justice looks like, so that those conversations happen and that can be reflected in policy and higher level like decision making.
Mm-hmm. And like, we definitely need to have these conversations, because I can't remember like hearing youth come together, like thinking during COVID, like there have been a lot of like virtual sessions and things like that. But when you think about your region, there is that privilege aspect, but there are almost, I think, yeah, according to like 2016 census, like 146,000 youth between like 15 to 25. And that's like when you're like in high school or going into university, and like having that agency and control more so over what you eat, what you're doing, and going to university or college, and having that, yeah, that control over what food means to you and how you make sense of it. So it's been a lot of disruption there, and maybe others, like maybe some people lives haven't been disrupted, and that's where like really need to understand that privilege aspect. And it's, yeah, trying to understand if it isn't disrupted, what does it, not what it means to you, but what it means to others that are having to think about where their meal's coming from, or yeah, really thinking about history of like food on their plate. And I think like maybe taking from like the art perspective or the communal care perspective. I know on BA you do quite a bit with the Tamil Archive project down in Scarborough. So I'm just thinking, I know we heard about agriculture and like public health and food security. So what about like, yeah, when you're at the table with your plates and that communal aspect of how food brings people together? What do you have to add on for that part?
Well, first of all, before the food even gets there, right? Like when I think about the food landscape that I'm currently experiencing, like during the summer, my grandparents like put their whole lives into our garden, right? So like whatever we eat comes from there, like all our curries come from there. And they like share plants with like the neighbors, and you have cousins that come over and they give vegetables. And like when you think about that aspect of communal care and how food can work to kind of enhance that experience, but then how you also have to think about how food can be the result of communal care, but also, I guess, is the catalyst for communal care as well. It can be a way that we show that we care about each other. So with the Healing Arts Dinner Circle, right before COVID, it was supposed to be a place where we could come around food and we could talk about differences in inequality and how we do our social justice advocacy, and teaching people in our workshops and our dinners about the things that we were skilled at, and finding things like in ourselves that we could give to other people. And that's where I think food plays a really big part in communal care. But I don't know whether I defined communal care, like being there for each other and just the idea of having a community. And food acts as a way for us to, I guess, come together as one, but it also makes us ask questions about the food and where it's coming from. So like when you talk about vegetarianism and being a vegan or being a pescatarian, you have to think about like what kind of privilege you have to be making those choices in the first place. Like to eat a chickpea burger instead of a meat one, when the meat ones are so much cheaper, right? Like $6 for 4 chickpea burgers, but like it's so much cheaper to get a beef one, right? Like what about our diets and our privilege have to do, like what about our privilege influences our diets and what we take in and the quality of the food that we take in, and how can we use communal care to kind of make that more equitable? Like those are all questions we need to answer.
And like the communal care part really, yeah, it's not even like, yeah, being at the table or like when we get to enjoy the meal, but like thinking about growing it. How is it grown with the community? And then kind of like on the path to where it reaches at the end and we're consuming it, right?
Yeah.
So I guess, again, a lot to unpack, but like this is a great, I guess, panel to like start those discussions. And I know like with our own like workplace at European Food Network, we love to like continue these conversations and learn more from the youth and kind of, yeah, imagine a future where food is a human right, and sadly it's not been treated as one. And even the point earlier with the keynote with Jessica, thinking about food programs, it wasn't until recently that there's like a bill just to think about looking at that. And Canada is one of those countries that does lack having the national food program in schools. And there are different initiatives for sure, but we don't have something so like across the scale type of thing, like on a national level. And that's something that we do need. And even recognizing poverty wasn't like nationally recognized until recently. So we do fall behind a lot in Canada, as much as we do talk about the prosperity and giving back and other things. We really need to hold government and from municipal level all the way to federal accountable, and we all play a role in the food that we eat and consume. I'm wondering if anyone else has anything to add or something that popped in mind, just thinking about the food landscape, impact of COVID in York region.
Yeah, I can add a little something. In terms of food landscape, I grew up eating Peruvian food. So my parents had to go to 2 grocery stores. Like, you can't just go to 1 grocery store to get all your things. So I think about that a lot in terms of my food environment. Even though York region is so diverse, you can't always get everything at the 1 grocery store. My local grocery store has definitely expanded, their international aisle, but I still need to go to other places to get the products I want, Peruvian products. So when COVID happened, I thought, do I want to go to 2 grocery stores? I should be socially distancing. I should be staying at home. I chose to go grocery shopping instead of my father because he's an older adult. So I thought, okay, maybe I just we'll eat differently this week. So it's something to think about, in the food environment, even though Vaughan and York region is so diverse. I can't get those things at 1 grocery store, but the Asian grocery store that's in my area, they carry a huge variety of things, not just Asian products, Latin American products, Mexican, Caribbean. So they're being diverse, but maybe other national corporate grocery stores aren't. So it's something to think about, when you think about how do I keep my cultural foods.
Yeah, for sure. I guess that even brings up the question, I know we're 6 months in with COVID right now, but in the beginning, we're going to, it still is that fear of when you do see certain ethnic grocery stores, and if you go into Toronto, being in communities that are highly impacted and not having resources, and there is that stigma on yeah, there has been the anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, a lot of just othering people and groups. So even that experience, or not feeling safe, which you would know where you would normally go, and there's the extra layer of, am I gonna get sick, or these assumptions and that oppression that just is just in the system that we need to address, and to ensure yeah, we can have access to safe food, affordable, culturally appropriate food. It's a lot to talk about, and it's heavy, and yeah, if someone had an answer to it, it would have already happened by now, but it is very complex. It requires a lot of different people to come together, and that systems thinking piece is really important for that. And I guess we've been talking about the privilege aspect and wanting making our cultural food or having to make those sacrifices to kind of change our diets with COVID. I'm just thinking of what have been maybe some gains, or some moments of optimism when you do think of a food, and where you were just maybe at home and maybe reconnecting with things. What have been some moments of aha moments, or moments of realization or comfort that you've had with food?
I can start. I think I've never eaten more with my brother and dad in the last 5 years than I have because of COVID. We were at home a lot. So I also started meal planning with my dad, which was something new for us. So that's been kind of fun, just planning our meals, and we eat mostly Peruvian food. So it's just been nice family time because we've been, kind of locked in our homes a bit. So that has been, one upside to this really weird year.
Mm-hmm. How about for others? I can say the same for me. Always being maybe away from home. We always do share meals together, but you get to really sit down and maybe enjoy the meals that take longer to make, or really get to appreciate it more.
I think one thing that I noticed throughout COVID, on the more so the food production side of things, is that increased passion and interest for growing. And then also for seeds, seeds were sold out everywhere. I think there were some seed companies that I heard were like digging into their second and third year reserves just to meet demand, which is great, but also scary, right? Like it sort of showcased how important seeds are, not just for like farmers, not just for, like it's for our food supply. And yeah, the positive side of it was just people starting to think about seeds and like, you know, having conversations with people about like, yeah, there's different varieties of broccoli. It's not just broccoli that we're buying at the stores, but like there's different varieties. There's different ones that do well against, you know, cabbage loopers, or do well against frost, or, you know, bolt resistant. Like just having those conversations that would never have come about if things were sort of just regular, normal. We can just buy that broccoli from the grocery store rather than like we're gonna try and grow it ourselves. And then like being able to link all those things with like climate change. How do we adapt our you know, vegetables and our food to our climate, to our changing climate, to you know, different different environments around us. And then seeds from different cultural like foods, right? There's lots of people being like, yeah, but I can't find callaloo seeds. I can't find the stuff that I want to grow to eat. So having conversations about like why that is and what we can do about it has been really exciting for me.
Just to add on to that point about seeds, I remember like when school went online, I used to have to commute like an hour and a half to school and back. So I had 3 hours of extra time to do nothing. And my grandparents actually moved out in January. So I was like, the garden. So I always thought that gardening was an old people thing, like, you know, you do that when you're old and you have nothing else to do. But like now that I had so much time on my hands and I had seeds, like I was spending hours outside just like watering the plants and like tilling, I guess if that's the word, and and like putting seeds and like I guess just watching it grow and like having something to tend to every single day. And then like now when I look at it and there's so much green and I just like sitting there and looking at like the rabbits eat the leaves, like even though, you know, that could be going in curries, like they're here and there's so many animals and it feels good to have like been a part of that, right? And like to have created something at some point. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, that connection to like the land and when you grow your food and that cultural cuisine type of thing, it really does like add a kick to your dish when you make it type of thing. And yeah, I guess just like hearing it's like, yeah, you don't know how much time, like when you do spend time commuting and doing all these things, I think it has been a realization of how much we do put on ourselves and how like pressure and things can be draining when what if we like reroute things and if they are online, and it has provided that benefit of like getting people together, saying like, where am I going to get that extra hour in the day? But like you get that extra hour and you get to grow and you get to know where your food comes from beside just like Foodland or from the grocery store type of thing. It's that real connection. It sounds really great. And like I think the gardening aspect, I think probably like April or May, like a lot of people are talking about quarantine gardens, gardening, whether you're in a condo apartment, kind of seeing where everything's at. They have a lot of these things do going on. I'm just like looking in the chat, like a lot of people are bringing up stuff in Toronto, Food Share. Yeah, Food Share does a lot of great work. In Calgary, like there's a lot of like different organizations and groups doing these things. And we also, I guess we can bring this up in like the Q&A too. Even with the York Region Food Network, we do have like the Good Food Box. And do we still have seeds, Jess?
We do of some types, and then some other types run out. Yeah.
Okay. So like we do have a lot of resources too, and I think it's just a matter of like amplifying the things and like the connections that we have even in York Region and because people do want to talk about these things, and we're more than people assume being a food channel. We do connect people with food in other ways. So I guess being mindful of time and things like that. I guess like on the last point, what initiatives have you been a part of that kind of bring or challenge change? And maybe we can start with Charlene.
Okay, I just most recently, I've been volunteering with Food Secure Canada, so I'm working on an article about migrant justice. So, and it's geared towards youth and how youth can be involved in advocating for change. And I think, when we think of these things, these initiatives, like we should always keep a seat at the table for youth, because I think as a youth growing up, I didn't think I could advocate for change or make change, but like we've seen with so many, and even on our panel, like we can do many things. So I like getting involved with like some kind of like confidence building and youth development in that sense.
Mm-hmm. How about yourself, Jessica?
Yeah, I always I feel like I'm in the process, like constantly just in the process. Certainly with York Region Food Network, there's opportunities for a lot of different like conversations, a lot of different advocacy, and a lot of just like reflection on individual and organizational levels. And that's been really, really exciting and fulfilling, and still requires a lot of work. Yeah, I guess for myself, it's a matter of like we're we are starting a farm, my partner and I, and so this is the stage where you you have to think about what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, and like how you can integrate what you believe in with what you're actually doing. And so yeah, a lot of those conversations have been happening between us and with other people and other communities, of like, what does that look like, to, yes, I have co-purchased land with my family, but then what are our roles and responsibilities, right? Like as settlers, as treaty people, as people who are just caring for the land. Uh, yeah, figuring that out, like asking those difficult questions and stuff that's sort of heavier but like super necessary, and like how do we take what we're doing and serve our communities best. So yeah, there's lots of different things that can be done, right? But like even things like resource redistribution, right? So if you have privilege and you have resources, it's your responsibility to redistribute that. So yeah, having conversations like that and just really digging deep. And I think one thing that I've committed to recently is just to go deeper in my work rather than trying to like be broad. Because I know when I was much younger, it was like, I can do this, I can do that, I'm interested in this, I just can't wait to explore that, and just like reading all over, right? Everything, and that's awesome. But then also once you get to know yourself a bit better, like just sort of understanding your strengths and weaknesses, and really going deep into what it is that you can do for the movement, and what it is that your strengths are, and what you're capable of. So that was a very loosey-goosey way of answering that.
No, but it all makes sense. And I guess like maybe to kind of like wrap things up and like final thoughts, like how about yourself, on BA?
Well, kind of like Jessica said, I'm kind of more in the broad, like doing everything I can possible stage of my life. I haven't really picked a couple of things where I'm like, this is what I'm gonna do, and I'm kind of waiting on that to happen. But I don't think I've been as active as I want to in the food space like you guys are, and I think what you guys do is awesome. But it's mostly been with communal care, with TAP, and the Healing Arts Inner Circle series and the workshops that we do with them. And on top of that, a lot of the work I do is with accessibility, so Braille, American Sign Language. It's a lot about using the privilege that I have, and trying to like change the barriers that are in place in the little ways that I can. But on top of that, I do edit. I like to use like my ability with words and writing, and I really, really love words. So I do that in spoken word, and I write for magazines and it has a lot to do with communal care. But that's about it.
Yeah, and like all those things are really important, and like it's different age ranges and everyone's on I guess a different stage in that, and it's just how we kind of figure out our path from there. And I don't want to say like we're kind of reaching the end, and I know there's been a lot of discussion in the chat box, and everyone has like shared their information, like if anyone has questions for Jessica, for Charlene or Umbihe, like that's your contact information. But there was one question I think someone brought up, and I think Jessica could answer this, or you can definitely like reach out to Jessica about what do folks think about the lack of BIPOC or two-spirited LGBTQIA plus farm ownership in York Region. I know like Jessica and I have a conversation about that, and how I guess it goes back to like your point from like even yesterday about that privilege aspect and giving youth a voice and beyond looking at the business model of things.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think like, what do I think about it? I think it sucks. But yeah, I think part of, figuring out what you can do is, if you have that privilege, if you have the resources, is make it a safer space for folks like BIPOC folks and 2S LGBTQ folks to like be in rural, specifically for me, I guess, be in rural spaces that traditionally might be super conservative and kind of scary to be in, right? Like that's a huge barrier as well. I know like I was privileged enough to have a family that would be supportive, and we co-purchased, the farm in Lindsay. But like I still like, I'll still worry about my parents. Like I worry about them being out there. It's sort of like that isolation. And then certainly like my partner and I were like a queer couple, like to be a queer couple farming out in rural areas, it definitely is something that's a little like makes us nervous. But I think like it starts with like people being able to get there, and then I guess like being able to create those spaces from within, right? So that's definitely something that we're thinking about and trying to do. And yeah, I think just if you can support growers and farmers and people like BIPOC folks and 2S LGBTQ folks with disabilities, like formerly incarcerated folks, like people who need that support and need that help, like do it. That's super important to get everyone out there.
Mm-hmm. And kind of like on that point, this is something I know we don't have much time left and we're a little bit over. For anyone of those interested, it's been a very lively chat, and everyone also on the panel. We're thinking at York Region Food Network something about developing a food pledge. So like, what can it look like? What do we need in York Region? Who needs to be at the table? What about youth voices? So if you're interested in being a part of it, we're going to resend out the Survey Monkey. I think it might be a little bit difficult to link from the chat, but feel free definitely to get connected with Morgan. She's our food policy coordinator, and we'll be sending out an email afterwards again, just to like just to get feedback. And if you want to subscribe and be more connected, we're definitely going to send out more information on that end. And yeah, we just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone for attending and bearing with us. It's the first time we ever really done this online and in very short notice. So we really appreciate all the questions, the engagement, dealing with the disruption. So definitely feel free to connect with us online, also through email, many other channels, and we'll be sending out a survey so you can subscribe to our newsletter. And I guess that brings us to the end of our first, but not last, youth panel and what youth are thinking about. So there's a lot to digest and a lot to still bring and stir up, I guess, stir pot for change. And we hope that you enjoyed this, and we hope to bring you much more discussion virtually and maybe in person as things calm down and we weather the storm of what is COVID. But yeah, much needed discussion and change. We are the change. So here's to making that change and moving forward with that.